Okay, so now I'm going to create a series of joint chains, and these will be temporary. But this step will allow us to ensure that the skeleton will fit inside the model perfectly when it's posed, as you see it here, after we rotate and move these joints so that they're perfectly straight, and then create the final skeleton by point snapping it to this temporary skeleton. But before I do that, I think I forgot to rebuild the neck chain because I want to have two joints for my neck here. So I'm going to rebuild this curve to 2. So back to my rigging shelf here. Click on my joint tool. It's a good idea to reset the tool before you begin with it. I'll leave point snap on here. So I'll start with my hip. So click on the hip locator. This one I want to be a standalone joint, so when I'm done with the hip, I'm going to press enter so that I can begin a new joint chain. And I'll start at the bottom of the spine, work my way up. And this will be a contiguous chain. To the head. So you just work your way up from the bottom of the spine to the neck, both neck joints, the joint at the base of the skull, and then finally the joint at the top of the head. Then the jaw, new chain. Y to get the new chain, one for the eye, to the leg, the arm, and then each of the fingers. Now when we eventually parent the finger chains to the wrist on the final skeleton, it's important that you parent in a specific order. It'll be the middle finger chain first, followed by the index, the ring, the pinky, and then finally the thumb. So I'm going to create these joint chains in that order, even though this is the temporary skeleton, just so you get used to that order, because that's what human IK wants to see in the parenting order. So I'll start with my middle, index, ring, and pinky. And now I'm going to create two final curves between the hips and the first leg joint, and between the last spine joint and the arm. Human IK has these intermediary joints between the arm and the spine, and between the leg and the hip, and we need to create those. So I'm just going to select my EP curve tool again, and snap a curve between the hip and the top of the leg, and then one between the last spine joint and the shoulder. Display the edit points on both of these curves, and rebuild them to 2 spans. And now I'm going to rotate these joints manually so that the arm and legs are as perfectly straight as I can get them. And then once I get them as perfectly straight as I can rotate them by eye, I'll point snap the joints to each other so that they're perfectly mathematically straight. But first I want to parent the finger joints to the wrist. So again, the middle first, index, ring, pinky, thumb, and then lastly I'll select the wrist joint and press P, which is the hotkey for parent. So now I'll start rotating the arm, and I can use the grid lines to help me get it as straight as I can get it. You can also use the top, bottom, and side borders of the view panel to help you get them straight. You want to get them as straight as you can get by eye. And sometimes you'll want to switch between the rotate axis being the object and the world. That looks pretty good. And then I'll rotate this forearm joint in the X so that the hand is fairly straight in this side view. So about like that. Then I'm going to do the same thing for the leg. So about like that. So that's pretty good. So once I get them as straight as I can by eye, I'm going to switch to the Move tool, set the axis orientation to world, go into pivot mode for the upper arm twist joint, and I'm going to point snap this, so I have point snap on, in the Y axis and the Z axis to that shoulder joint. I do both axes, and that will make sure that they're perfectly mathematically straight. Same thing here. Point snap it in the Y and the Z to the joint above it. And you point snap by clicking on the axis that you want to use to activate that axis. Make sure you have point snap on by either pressing the button or using the hotkey, which is V. And then you middle mouse drag that axis to the point you want to snap it to. So when you want to snap a joint to the joint above it, you activate the axis and then middle mouse drag that axis to the joint above it. And then I want to move the hand as a whole. So I'll select the wrist joint, get out of pivot mode by pressing insert again. And this one I want to move as a whole, so point snap that in the Z, in the Y, and then go down and do the same thing for the leg. Again, this time I'll do this in pivot mode. And down here I'll snap this in the X to that joint here. And snap this in the Y to this joint. So that looks good. Now, as I mentioned, this skeleton is temporary, so I'm going to add a prefix hierarchy name to these joints by selecting each of the joint chains. I'm going to modify prefix hierarchy names, and this is going to put a prefix in front of each of the joint names, and I'll call them temp underscore. And then I'm going to create a new layer with the joints that I have selected, which is the rightmost button here on your display layer section below your channel box. So that's going to create a new layer with those objects contained in that layer. Double click to rename it, and I'll call this temp underscore skeleton. And then I'm going to set the display type here to reference. So there's an R there. And what reference does is it allows you to see the objects, in this case the joints that are contained on that display layer, but I can't select them. And that will allow me to point snap the new skeleton to these joints without accidentally selecting this skeleton. And then I can easily get rid of the old joints with that display layer as well. So I'm going to create the final skeleton in a very specific order so that I can use the script I made for renaming the joints. So back to my rigging shelf, select my joint tool, start at the hips. Again, this will be a standalone joint, and you'll see that the joint names start over from the beginning. So the reason I renamed those joints to temp underscore is so that when I create the first joint for the final skeleton at the hip, it's named joint 1 by default, and that way I can use that script. So press enter, select the joint tool again, start at the base of the spine, work my way up. Then I'll create a standalone joint here for this intermediary joint between the hips and the leg. Press enter, get the joint tool again, create the leg chain, start a new chain for the intermediary joint between the last spine joint and the arm. So click that, press enter, get the joint tool again, create the arm chain, and create the chains for the fingers in the specific order. So starting with the middle finger chain, index, ring, pinky, and then finally the thumb. New joint chain for the jaw, and a new joint chain for the eye. Okay, so now I'm going to use this script that I created to rename the joints automatically to the naming convention that Human IK is going to look for. And this file is attached to the week 1 announcement in the classroom. So I'm just going to select all of the text here, copy it, open up my script editor, paste it in the input section at the bottom, then go to Command and execute. And that will automatically rename all of the joints to their correct names. Now, if you decided to use more joints in your spine or fewer joints in your spine, you would have to edit this text so that when it gets to an additional joint, you have to rename this. So if there was a spine 7, that would be joint 9. So I'd have to change this from rename joint 9 to neck to rename joint 9 to spine 7. And then I would have to change all of the numbers and names after this to make up for that. If there were fewer, if you only had 5 spine joints, then joint 8 would be the name for the neck joint. So to have to reorder all the names after that. So that's why I suggested you stick with 6, and that way you can just use this script as is. So now I'm going to get rid of the old skeleton by right-clicking on the display layer and choosing Select Objects, pressing Delete, and then right-clicking again and deleting the layer. And now I'm going to parent the final skeleton together. So I'll select the left up leg joint, the top leg joint, and the dummy joint in between, and press P to parent. And then select the dummy, shift select the hip, P to parent, spine and hip, P to parent, left arm, left shoulder, that intermediate joint, parent, and then that joint to the final spine joint. And I can parent the jaw and the eye to that joint at the base of the skull, the head joint. And then I'll parent the fingers and the thumb in the specific order: middle, index, ring, pinky, thumb. Select the wrist joint last, and P to parent. Okay, so now before I move on, I need to reset the skeleton so that the bottom of the foot lines up with the grid plane. So I'm going to select the hips and press Ctrl G to group it. And that way I get something above the hips. And I'll set the pivot point to the ball of the foot, the joint at the ball of the foot. Press Insert to go into pivot mode, and then hold down V for point snap and drag it to that ball joint. Insert to get out of pivot mode. and then I'm going to move it up in the Y so that it lines up with the grid. And use grid snap, which is X. And then I'll take the hip again, and I'll hold down Shift and P to unparent it. And that way I have the hips by themselves. I can get rid of this group node. So now I need to set the local rotation axes, or the LRAs, so that they're consistent within each chain. Now, local rotation axes determine how an object, or joint in this case, rotates. So I want to select all of the joints. So I'm going to use a button on the shelf that I created for you. This file is also attached to the week 1 announcement in the classroom. To load a shelf in Maya, you click on the gear symbol to the left of the shelf, go to Load Shelf, navigate to wherever you save that shelf on your computer that you downloaded from the classroom, and that shelf will show up here. It's called GRA 212. And then once you've loaded that shelf, click on the gear symbol again and click Save All Shelves. And that way all the shelves will be saved to your computer and will load automatically when you start Maya. So I want to display all of the local rotation axes. So I'll select the hips, and then I'm going to click this button that says Cell Down, SELDWN, and that will select all of the objects below it, in this case the joints, below it in the hierarchy. And then I go to Display, Transform Display, Local Rotation Axes. And then all of these axes appear that determine how the various joints rotate. So if I just scroll into any one of these and select the wrist joint, for example, you can see that the way that this wrist rotates is determined by that axis. So you can see that Z is pointing in this direction, and that means that Z is going around that axis. Y is pointing up, which means the Y is going around that axis pointing up, and then X is in this direction, and that's why X goes around that pole. So to change these local rotation axes, I'll just do one for you so that you can kind of see how this is supposed to go. You can select the top of the hierarchy, the hips, go to your Select by Component Type, which is this button up here on your menu bar. First, turn all components off by right-clicking on the arrow button to the right of that and choosing All Components Off, and then right-clicking on the question mark symbol and choosing just local rotation axes. And that will allow you to select just these local rotation axes. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate them so that they all line up and are consistent within each chain. So for the spine, neck, and head chain, I want Z to be pointing forward and Y to be pointing to the side. So you can see that right now, X is always pointing down the bone. That's the default setting when you create joints, but you can see that they're inconsistent. Sometimes Z is pointing in this direction, some pointing in that direction, Y is pointing in this direction on this joint, it's back in this joint. So I want them all to be so that Z is pointing forward and Y is pointing to the side. Once I select those, these three buttons on my shelf, the one that says LRA X90, LRA Y90, and LRA Z90, will rotate these local rotation axes 90 degrees in the X, in the Y, and in the Z. So in most cases, you're going to be rotating just in the X. So I'm just going to click this button until I see Z pointing forward and Y pointing to the side. And I would do that for every joint in my chain, so that all of the joints in the spine chain, neck chain, and head chain have Z pointing forward and Y pointing to the side. In the arm chain, I want Z pointing forward and Y pointing up. They are by default because we created these coplanar joint chains. So, but for the fingers, you'll probably notice that as you create a fist, as you curl your fingers in on your hand, they don't rotate straight up and down. They curl inward slightly. So for the hands, I want to select the joints on the index and rotate them slightly inward along the x-axis so that the finger is going to rotate slightly towards the center, and then do the same thing with the ring and pinky. Rotate them so they're inward just slightly, a little bit more for the pinky than the ring. And then the thumb, I want to rotate so that it rotates on the angle that you can see your thumb rotates. So slightly inward. And watch how your thumb curls downward to kind of get the angle that you want. And then for the leg, I'd want to set them so that Z points forward and Y points to the side for each joint, so that they're consistent. And again, you don't have to worry about the last joint in any of these chains because it's really not involved in the animation or the skinning, but you want these joint chains to be consistent for the entire skeleton. Okay, and now you can see that I've gone ahead and finished all of these LRAs so that they're consistent. So you can see that from the hip all the way through the spine, the neck, and the head, Z points forward and Y points to the side for each one. You only have to worry about the first jaw joint, but again, Z points forward, Y points to the side. For the eye chain, I would suggest you set them to be the world axis, so you want Y pointing up, Z pointing forward, and X pointing to the side, because they're really only there to rotate the eyeball, and it's a little bit easier to rotate according to the world axis. The arm has Z pointing forward and Y pointing up for each joint. I've rotated the axes for each of the fingers to be slightly inward. And then for the leg chain, Z points forward for each joint and Y points to the side. So now I want to take off the display of these local rotation axes because they're a little bit cumbersome to see on the screen. So I'll select the hips again, use my select down button to select all of the joints below it, and then go back to display, transform display, local rotation axes. And now I want to mirror the joints to the other side, which is very simple. So I'll start with the leg chain. So I want to select the first leg joint, which is left up leg dummy. Go to my rigging menu set, skeleton, open the mirror joints option box. And I want to mirror across Y and Z. It's always going to be the axis that you're trying to mirror across. And you can see that's the X axis that goes from one side to the other on my character. So it's always going to be the choice that doesn't include that axis. So in my case, that's going to be Y and Z because I want to mirror across the X. I want to choose orientation. And then I want it to automatically replace all of the instances of the word left with the word right. And you can only do one at a time. So I'll start with the leg and then I'll do the arm separately. Just apply and that will mirror it to the other side. Now I'll select the left shoulder joint and mirror that. And then finally, I'm going to create a new layer for this skeleton. So I'll select the hips again, click the Create New Layer and Assign Selected Objects button on my display layer. Double click to rename it. And I'll call this A Pose Skeleton. And that's it. Once you have this set up, you're ready to go. Just to show you how easy it is to set up the human IK rigging and how great that rig works, it's really the world's best rig as far as I'm concerned. That all I need to do is go to my skeleton menu, open the human IK module, and it will show up over here on the right, the bottom tab. Click Create Character Definition, and that's just going to connect the names of the joints you use to the rig. And since I'm having you use that script that I created for you that renames all the joints to match what human IK is looking for, all you have to do is select the hips joint, click the Load Skeleton Definition button, choose the default setting. You'll get the green check mark to let you know that it's found all of the joints and they're correctly named. And then click Create Control Rig. And voila, you're done. And this has everything you could possibly want. This very handy user interface that allows you to select the different parts easily. It has full body IK, which means that when you pull the arm, for example, it pulls the whole body with it. Same thing with the legs. Pull one leg, pulls the whole body. You can work in body part mode instead, and that way when you pull the leg or pull the arm, it doesn't pull the whole body. You have pinnable hands and feet. If I wanted the character to push against something with one of his arms or both of his arms, I could pose the arms out in front. And then I could pin the hands with the pinning buttons. And that way, when I move the character, the arms stay steady and the body moves against them. Getting back to the stance mode just by clicking on the stance button. So I'll unpin these. It has floor contacts. So I could turn on the floor contacts for the feet, and that way the feet will rotate against the floor and the character will push against the ground. So it really is a fantastic rig to work with, and it would take years to teach you how to get anywhere near this level of functionality by manually rigging. So you will learn some manual rigging techniques in this course, but the course is called Character Animation, so we want you to be able to focus on that. And I think allowing you to use the Human IK rig will give you a better chance of creating better animations in the course.